Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we're talking about non-apparel and in the hoop items for business. It's episode 121. All right, folks, welcome into the Takeup. Hopefully you're having an awesome Friday and you've had an awesome week full of opportunities, creativity, and everything you had hoped it would be for this wonderful week of decorating for apparel, embroidery, and all manner of creative output. So what we're going to talk about today going to be a fairly short show, simple show, hopefully something minorly inspirational if nothing else, and I'm really hoping to have some of your comments and questions as we go on because I know this is a place where we can have a lot of cross-pollination between kind of the home market, the commercial market, and the different kinds of stories we've all told about how we deal with last minute needs for things, adding in objects, items that don't usually fit to our usual catalog, decorating things that we might not usually decorate, and trying to expand ourselves to see what more we can do with our embroidery machines, with our decoration. So, like I said, what did we have up here today? We have stuff that's in the hoop and non-apparel items. So I'll talk a little bit about stuff that is standard non-apparel accessories, certainly, and discuss some of the difficulties I've had, some of the things that I've had to overcome and what we've done differently. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about classic in the hoop items. And as you'll see on the cover page here, we've got some very different kinds of things, some random totes, some ornaments and bookmarks and straps and tags, things that you might not necessarily expect to be part of your normal embroidery world. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I implemented them and how you can implement them. And honestly, the things that we consider when we're dealing with all this stuff, whether it's material considerations, maybe a little bit on digitizing for these things. And just like I talked about last week and discussing whether or not you need to become a digitizer in order to embroider, we can do all of these things with different levels of engagement, both in how much of the creation we want to control for ourselves and in how much we want to deal with the materials, how much we want to deal with creating the files ourselves, how much do we want to get involved with the process of these craft projects. Because that is the one danger. If when we're talking about doing stuff like this, where we are creating items in the hoop, and I'll define that again and talk about it in a moment. But when we're creating items ourselves, when we're not just throwing a blank into a hoop, running it on the embroidery machine and packaging it off, one of the dangers we can have is exposing ourselves to too much labor, too much intensity of work, difficulty of work, or having to have too much hands-on time into an individual piece to make it make sense for something that we're trying to profit on. Now, truthfully, I think one of the most powerful uses for items like this is actually in promotions, is in rewarding your customer and engaging and delighting your customer so that they think of you as a creative person who does creative work. I think that can be one of the best things we can do with items like this that are non-standard, that go beyond our usual work. However, I know, and some of the people who are here on the stream know, that you can make money, you can be profitable making items yourselves. And like I said, I will get into it further. I'm going to say hi to a few people who are here in the comments first, and then we'll talk about all this stuff. Like I said, maybe a slightly more simple show. I want to talk about this in an inspirational way just to make you think a little bit outside the box and to discuss the ways that we can maybe reduce our exposure a little bit to that extra work, that extra labor that makes a lot of commercial shops look at these processes and say, hey, not for me because it's too much work, not for me because it's too much labor. I think that there are ways that we can make less labor out of it, or we can leverage these things, like I said earlier, as marketing, as rewards, as ways to engage and delight our clients. So it's something to think about, and we can certainly discuss the different ways that that kind of plays out. So first, let's say hi to a few folks who are here in the comments. Cindy King is in from Texas saying, good afternoon, sewing and listening. Boy, that is the best way to do it. Keep those needles moving. As I always say, you don't have to always be watching things to get something out of it. Jeff Fuller, Fuller Embroidery Works is here, and Adam of BJHats.com is here. Hello, happy to have you here. Jeff, somebody who has himself made some corporate ornaments, I believe some freestanding lace-based ornaments with corporate logos, and I think that's something that's really interesting. The concept of corporate work and doing in the hoop projects seems like very alien to each other, but it doesn't have to be. Uh, Justin Armenta of J Digitizing saying hello, 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 Justin. Frank from out in the UK, Frank Dunn, doing a great job and always sharing, always keeping people together. So thank you, Frank, for being here. Eddie is in saying, what's good, Eddie? Happy to have you in. Ramona saying, I made it. Afternoon, everyone. Afternoon. Sally is in saying, good evening to everybody. Good evening, Sally. Kay is in saying hi. Maureen is in from Pennsylvania. Keep cool. Yeah, everybody who is having trouble keeping cool or dealing with heavy rains, take care of yourselves. By all means, make sure you're okay and stay safe. And Joanne says, hey, and happy Friday. Glad to be here today. Glad to have you here. So, like I said, maybe a little bit of a lighter show, maybe not so heavily technical. But what I really want to get through people's heads is that some of this stuff is not as complicated as it seems. And then to talk about some of the things I've done in general and discuss, once again, how much do you want to get into this? How much can you get into this? Do you need to invest deeply to do non standard items? I'm going to go ahead and say no. But as with many other things, the amount of investment has to do with what we're going to consider our output on this stuff, right? So let me start with a brief story of one of the first things that I did a lot of that I found was on this spectrum of kind of stuff that's not maybe the standard, but was can be a little difficult, can be a bit of a pain to do, but was lucrative at the time. But it was something where we got to a point where we didn't want to invest much further in it, and the trend kind of burned out. And in this case, I'm talking about something that's not necessarily in the hoop. It's actually something that's embroidered blank and it's fairly standard. And in this case, I'll go ahead and bring up first the channel cap again. You can see over on the right hand side, there's a bag with a tag. I'll give you a better picture of this. And the first thing was gear tags. Lots of people do these. It's not like it's all that particularly interesting to do gear tags. Lots of people digitize or embroider for them and digitize special things to make these things work. But for us, gear tags really where it was at for a while. And honestly, I'm going to be clear with you. The shops that I worked in were very largely business to business. They were often in larger multiples. We did not run really small minimum orders that much. When we did, that was not the norm. The norm was, in the dozens generally. And then as minimums dropped through the years, certainly 12 or above, often of exactly the same thing. That is very much the norm. We are not thinking about individual pieces very often. So when I talk about these gear tags, we'll go ahead and bring in my screen here where I've got some stuff on a gallery. I've got some other things we'll discuss as far as creating the stuff, but let me just talk about this ahead of time. Um, these gear tags, this is what I'm talking about. This is the kind that I did quite a bit of. And I had some other friends like me who liked Viking Age and Scandinavian stuff. So you can see a little Thor's hammer that's on this one. And this one I'm showing you because it's one done for an actual friend of mine. So I don't feel quite so bad showing you a random, name or something else where it's somebody else's project. This one I did for a friend of mine. But this was during a time where a lot of things like this were being stitched. Now, this is not the exact one. I went ahead and made a mock-up for you so you could see it, but this is very similar to the kind of gear tags that I was doing at the time. So these are fairly heavy webbing, or at the very least, I wouldn't say it's heavy so much as it's very dense. So this is very much more like what you might consider old school seat belt webbing. That's what you would think of this kind of webbing that I was working on at the time. So pretty dense webbing, pretty heavy stuff. Didn't exactly embroider perfectly well because honestly, we have to think about when we are embroidering anything, we're jamming a needle thousands of times through an existing piece of material. And when we're trying to make space for something in a very densely woven material like we have in this seatbelt style webbing, there was definitely a tendency for rippling stuff like that. However, what I am going to say about this is once I got this to, let's say, I wouldn't say a science, but once I got myself a process around this work, I didn't have too much trouble dealing with putting simple names and simple single color icons on these without having, a great deal of difficulty getting them done. It was something that when I first did them, I felt some trepidation. When you're used to throwing shirts on a hooping jig, sticking a left chest on them and rolling out the door, something like this, which we didn't have any fixtures for, we didn't have any extra kind of accommodations for, was a pain. Also, by their very nature, they're personalizable. They are something that's going to very often have a name on them. We did do quite a few of them that had general, either corporate logos, logo types were pretty popular, stuff like that. But generally, a name personalization is going to be a chief use for something like this, a gear bag, a luggage tag. Yes, there's the, remove before flight stuff like that. And those are different things. They're not made the same way. These gear tags came in and became a thing for a while. But here's where we had that kind of gradient of how much engagement do we want versus what are we going to get out of them. They were absolutely a cool thing to have as an addition. We could charge a fair premium for them because it was more like a retail style product. They were individually these without any sort of specialty strap, jig, robot arm, clamp that was there to help me with this stuff. Essentially, what I had to do to make these work for us is make myself a jig by hooping up some stabilizer. Generally, we're using some cutaway stabilizer, tearaway stabilizer to create a window that I was then using an adhesive piece of stabilizer in to run multiples and tear them out. It was not the best method. It was done with very much like an applique with placement stitches, and then I would tear it out once it was done after having essentially done a placement, either tacking, depending on how much area I had to cover, or running a little bit of adhesive, run some underlay, run the stuff down, stitch it down, generally with one color with a name with a small icon. We weren't having too much trouble with them. However, I will say that because they are so dense, these things were pretty grabby and tended to grab onto the needle. So when I'm talking about your investment and kind of how much work you might have into them, this is where that gradient of how invested do we want to get kind of like reared its ugly head. When we were doing them, I didn't have enough of them to justify like setting up some sort of clamping system that was specific to these. And at the time, the kinds of clamps that are now available were not widely available. So now, the kind of clamps that we have, strap clamps that are available now, would make this a lot simpler thing to do. But at the time, I was setting it up without any equipment. And even then, the price of adding equipment or adding hooping aids, adding clamps to our setup, and having that potentially set up on our single head sampling machine in order to do these was a question. Did we do enough volume for those? And so, where we have that balance that we have to think about with any kind of product like this that is non-standard, and this includes some of the in the hoop and lace stuff we're going to talk about later, the freestanding type stuff. Um, we have this balance where we have to say, all right, can I do it with the existing equipment I have? How much time does it take to do the entire process? And is it then worthwhile? Am I going to either expand into it, sell into this market? Can I make this a product I'm going to use all the time? Is there enough desire for this product that I can then add to the complement of equipment I have, a proper strap clamp, something that's there, or even a custom manufactured clamp or fixture to make it much easier to hold these things in place without doing the dance of placement, adhesives, or tack downs, or whatever I do, sandwiching, in order to make these things stay put while I embroider them. For the shop I was working at, no. It turned out that these gear tags just were not a high enough value item for us, and they weren't something we were going to sell all the time. It was a small group of people who wanted them, so that we had a very quick spike of people who wanted them, and then they were gone. I will say this: if I were running a more complementary shop where other items, other product categories that I was running had similar desires, had similar needs, let's say that I'm doing name tapes, gear straps, and I'm doing, let's say, collars and leads for pets, where a strap clamp or something specific to that placement, specific to these items made sense, I could make a much better case for that. And in fact, one of the things we should think about in all of this, I talked about this in the kind of lead up to this show, is that we should think about using existing assets. It's the same with our equipment. We should think about ways we can use our existing equipment to make more out of them. That's why I was such a big proponent of patches. And honestly, the ornament thing makes some sense. We talked about ornaments last week. We're going to talk about them again this week. Why do I think those make sense? The same reason that patches make sense. It doesn't take a lot of extra equipment to make it happen. If it takes off, there isn't a lot of equipment investment necessarily, unless we decide to go into particular scales with it, or we want particular ways to finish them or make them faster. But we also can, if we want to make them more efficient, go into further equipment to make them faster, to make them better. So that's our balance that we're working on. So throughout me talking about all this stuff, I want you to keep in mind this concept of that balance. If you're a commercial shop, it may be fun to make some of these things. We do need to take into account how much time they take, what kind of equipment we currently have, and do we need more equipment, and is that on the balance? For these, did I need equipment to do these? Not necessarily. And if we had kept the names short enough, I might have even been able to use a standard magnetic hoop, magnetic clamp in a smaller size and said, hey, your window of decoration is just this size, and made this work without all the trouble that I had. At the time, with nothing but standard hoops available, nothing but standard equipment available, and no investment capital, at least released to me, in my department, in order to make this any better, it didn't make a ton of sense to keep doing these, especially when there were people who are out there doing these specifically and doing them at scale. So let's go ahead and grab some comments before I go into the next kind of portion of this. Let's see what you guys have to say about that. So let's let's discuss some of that for sure. Um, all right. So Joanne says, I made a massive amount of bag tags from faux leather once. They were giving away a big New York City event. Had the chance to have personalization at the event. Yeah, making stuff out of existing materials. I honestly, to tell you the truth, I would have rather made tags than doing this. If you look at the tags, and actually we'll pull these back up because this is something that was specific to these tags. It was part of this equation. If you look at the tags that we were talking about here, these had a molded, glued on fixture on the top of these. Lots of people will make straps like this that either have a stitched on fixture, they have a ring, and I'm going to talk about this little tag in a minute, and I'll bring myself back up real quick. This little tag in a minute that I purchased. Oh, it's green, so that's going to be real fun. But it essentially has a it has itself just a normal set grommet, and it has a normal keychain ring through it. And that's something I'm seeing quite a lot with a lot of the keychains and the ornaments. Honestly, grommeting, using a standard grommet to punch through the embroidery, a punch and a grommet set makes this very easy. In fact, if you can make a patch, you can make a key ring, you can make an ornament very quickly. Patches are very similar to this. If you want to cover the back, there's some other steps to go to, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But I think I would have rather made these tags if I could. And especially, I will say this, in this day and age where there are more and more blanks that are offered with the fixture portion of it, with the findings. If you're a jewelry person, that's the term I always use. My mother worked in jewelry for a while, like beading and silversmithing. The findings, the straps, the fixtures, the pieces that we add onto it, um, those things, if they are something you can attach after the fact, this becomes a much easier thing to do. And in fact, if you're going to go the whole hog into a strap clamp, you can have strap clamps that you advance the material and just continue sewing them, heat cut them at intervals, and then clip on your fixtures to put that ring or strap on. That's great. The problem I had at the time was that these were being brought to me. And like I said, these were originally customer supplied. And when I tried to get the specific brands that everybody was asking for, they had something like this, which was probably RF welded in place. It was something that was welded to the existing piece, and it made it a lot harder to mess with and hoop. And I really didn't enjoy working on them. And that's the thing, it is a very different animal if you can make it out of material you have yourself and if the process is fairly simple. The only problem with that is you have to figure in labor for even just adding a grommet, even adding a grommet, adding a ring to everything. Every time I have to feed a split ring through something, that should be something I think about as a potential part of the labor that's involved. And if I have to do 500 of those, believe me that feeding a split ring through each one of these starts to get pretty obviously an extra part of our work. So to finish up that comment from Joanne, she says, my machine hated the material, but I washed it and used a stretch needle to embroider and all was well. Weird mix, but it worked. Yep, I have definitely done that. And Joanne says, I've had trouble on webbing myself. Yeah. Depending on the kind of webbing, I will say the one nice thing about this heavy webbing, though it was kind of gummy, it tended to grab the needles. Anything that has a finer grain, it doesn't have big, coarse woven, and you can see it. The big, coarse weave is where you're going to have things like edge texture problems. People are going to want to throw a ton of density at it to try and fix this. We'll try and fix it with underlay. We'll use sharp needles, heavy, sometimes larger needles to make larger holes, and try and make something to repair this. But the truth of the matter is, if you're going to work on standard, rough, dog color webbing, you're not going to have the kind of edge you have on a woven shirt. We have to adjust our expectations a little bit too, because you're not going to get the kind of edge. I've had people say, man, my digitizer is doing a terrible job, and show me something, and they're running it on material so coarse that it is causing the needle to track and there's nothing to grab onto, and no amount of anything short of maybe using some sort of toppings that literally provide something for it to hold on to, or applying another thing. And I'll say this, I actually have worked on dog collars and stuff that were heavy and coarse by nature, but we added a ribbon or a material cover to them, and we embroidered on that and then stitched those on. But once again, that is labor. It's additional labor costs. You have to think about it. But what I will say is this, when we go through all of these things, one of the things I think makes for any of these either in the hoop or accessory projects to be useful to us as decorators who are already doing apparel, and I'm going to make that assumption for most of us, is when we use materials that don't require a lot of alteration on the file or of our process to work their best. So webbing and strapping, not great for that. They absolutely do cause issues when we're running. Whereas things like some of the things you do see used often in the ornament and badge world sometimes, like twill and felt and things that are fine grained or don't have a grain to them at all and don't really need much work to respond with a normal middle of the road embroidery file that we've digitized for normal apparel. Yes, some of the pull and push may not be exactly where we want it, but a lot of these things can hold up to you throwing a design on them, and it will not super adversely affect the quality. And that's something we have to think about. It's the same thing with kind of like the freestanding lace ornament thing too, because things hold up on their own when we use that stuff. Those you can honestly throw a middle of the road normal left chest file on them and they tend to hold up. Items like that can literally be thrown in at the end of a multi-head run and we don't have to do extra work on those. Those kind of items are great pack-ins, great add-ons, great products. Whereas something that requires a lot of extra effort, that requires us to do extra work and plan for them, can be extra investment, and we either have to charge more for that investment or we have to make some other accommodation. So let's talk about a couple more of those too. A couple more comments. Cindy says, I don't want to talk about any of this. I'm living it right now. Having to float bag pockets and hold the bag while I sew a logo and a name, painful. Absolutely. I've been there, floating garments, floating items. In fact, what I'm going to do really quickly is show you some of the stuff that is relatively new in comparison, or it was definitely something I didn't have in my original shops that helps. And in fact, let's go ahead and show you. This is from Hoop Tech. There are other people making straps and clamps and things. This is just, if you've been to the trade shows, Hoop Tech is often there showing this stuff. If you've seen me talk about specialty fixtures, I often show some of Hoop Tech's stuff. And what I'm going to show you is some of the specialty things they have that make some of these items easier to deal with, some of the accessory items. And as you can see, you definitely have to still have a machine that has a cylinder arm that will go inside some of this stuff. So if you've got a super old school machine with a picker and a big cylinder arm, that's going to have trouble getting inside of these things. Some of these clamps are just like, oh yeah, great, I can put a glove on it. If you can't fit your cylinder arm inside of the glove, you're still going to have some issues with this thing, but these can help. Glove clamps. This is another one they call a koozie clamp. I'm going to say a can cooler because I believe koozie is actually trademarked, but koozie clamps, so you can get those in there. And the other thing I'm going to show you is you can get items that are made to be stitched after the fact. So, and one of those is can coolers like this, and I'll show that to you in a minute. You know, pocket clamps, shoe clamps, and strap clamps. You see here, a strap clamp like this, if you were going to do tons of strap work, by all means, I think a strap clamp makes a lot of sense, right? Makes a lot of sense, can make a lot of sense, can be useful for you. But you know, it depends on how you feel about it. It depends on how you feel about the investment and if you think that that market is going to help with you. But these kind of things, especially clamps, can be part of it for sure. It can be part of making this stuff happen, but this is where we get to the next level of investment. It's easy enough to go ahead and grab yourself something that makes this possible. Like, you want to do drink coolers? Well, and this is from All Stitch. This is only one of a million suppliers that does this, but they have a nice range of them that you can buy individually. So I thought I'd show them to you. This is something I've seen with the sublimation market where they get these unsewn coolers so that they can do a full all over print on them. We can do the same, use them for embroidery. We get an unsewn can cooler like this, and then it only takes a couple of straight stitches on a regular straight stitch flat machine to get this stuff to work. Now, sewing on neoprene is not always awesome. No, but this is something that can be done. You can use something that's made specifically as a blank like this in order to make these things work. So you can make these and then sew them after the fact, but it does mean that we have to realize we're going to stitch something in after the fact. We are going to have to do some later work on these pieces, and that's not necessarily something that we want to do. So it depends on your investment. It depends on what you want to do. Unsewn the drink coolers like this, these are something that doesn't take a ton of extra labor, but there is extra labor and it is something you're going to probably be doing manually, so you may not like it. If you're going to be able to do small amounts of decoration, you've got a small cylinder arm, maybe we can use something like these koozie clamps to make it easier. Otherwise, you can imagine trying to roll one of those things backward is probably not going to be for most of us. Whereas something like this, the straps, they're not that bad. The straps don't really cause too much effort, don't really require too much labor to get those to work. So, you know, it really depends on what you think about that particular work. It's not necessarily an issue to make those. It just means you have to worry about how much labor you're putting into it. So it really depends, right? A couple more comments before we go on. Joanne says, I feel your pain, Cindy. I had to do a heavily embroidered trench coat once, had to hold it like a baby the whole time. Definitely been there with bags. Jenny says, lace is far too time consuming to make money from. I would say nothing is necessarily too time consuming if you charge enough, but your market has to bear it. And that's the thing we have to talk about. I know, like I said, I would love to hear Jeff did some ornaments for his local companies that they did in that fashion. You know, it just depends. I would say an easier way to do those is probably to do patch style ornaments or even the felt style ornaments. If you wanted to do that for a company, might be easier to do with an embroidery machine. But yeah, it really depends. I think it can take a lot of time. And then Joanne says, "Yep, her stuff was a dog collar. Absolutely, absolutely can be an issue. It can happen." And then That's what she did, stitched on a ribbon and added it by machine stitching, and glad it happened to a real pro like me. You know what? I'll say this: there is no difference between home embroiderers and quote unquote pro embroiderers in the fact that we all encounter materials that work better or don't work as well for embroidery, and we have to deal with them. What I will say is, you may find that for your particular usage, for your particular needs, some of these things don't stand up. And for us, dog collar work, if you set up a machine to do it well and you have clamps and you're ready for it, that's awesome. But then you have to sell it, you have to market it, you have to be on top of that as one of the things you offer and know how to do it. For people who do mostly like shirts, outerwear, and hats, it may not be the traditional thing you do all the time, and you may not want to add it to your product mix. You may want to find somebody else who does it instead. It just depends. So it really depends on how it is. And Cindy says, yes, I invested in my hands. Yeah, and that's the thing. You invested opportunity cost. While you're holding on to everything, you can't do any other work. And that's something we have to remember when we're pricing this stuff out. Catherine says, good evening from Switzerland. Awesome. I'm happy to have you here. And Cindy says, who the heck would embroider a koozie? We print them. Hey, and I agree. One of the other things we can do is invest in print. If you're an embroidery only shop or if you're at home doing embroidery only, there's never been a time that it's more available to get small heat press printers going on to do either transfer stuff like that or to do cut vinyl work. And a lot of that stuff, I'll even say this: I have encountered uh, a hat style that for me, I decided that embroidery wasn't the way. And this one was a bike hat. It was a bike hat made of a ripstop nylon-like product, and it was so light that the embroidery would absolutely bundle it up. It would kind of draw it together. The pulling was terrible. Even with stabilizer on it, wasn't great. It didn't look great. And for the kind of fine detail the person wanted on that material, it made more sense by far to heat press it. You had to be careful heat pressing it because of the temperatures involved, but all day long it was a better product. We have to know that sometimes. But we were going to talk about some of this other stuff, so we'll get to that. But so Sally says, "What's a koozie? Never heard of it. It's a can cooler." I will go ahead and bring this up one more time for the heck of it. Um, but yeah, a koozie or can cooler is an insulator for your canned beverage, whether that's your favorite adult beverage or something else. And as you can see in this case, I'll go ahead and zoom in on these. These are all splayed open, but as you see here with when you're hovering over it, it fits over a can. It's generally like a neoprene sleeve that keeps your can cool. Some people embroider them. It's never been my favorite thing to do. You're right. But I wanted to present it because people were asking me, hey, how are they getting these embroidered pieces? What are they doing? And many people are buying them flat and then stitching the edges together after the fact. But this is another thing. For a shop like mine, where we had industrial straight stitch sewing machines on hand and people who were very fast at them, I can imagine doing this. I wouldn't necessarily want to embroider these, but I can imagine if I want to do an all over, let's say I had a white version of this, and they generally have a polyester material on the outside. If I were trying to do an all over can cooler, I can imagine sublimating these flat and then stitching them together so that I didn't have any of the artifacts of having to sublimate around a a flexible round material. Instead of having to do that in 3 dimensions, I would do it in 2 dimensions, get a beautiful wraparound, and then set one of the people in the shop that I worked with who was adept at using an industrial straight stitch machine to sew those together. Right. That's the thing. It depends on the assets you have at hand. It depends on who's doing the work. You're doing all the work and you're not somebody who can sew, then that doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense. Then you're on Cindy's watch where you'd rather just heat press them. And believe me, heat press printing is a great way to go. If you're an embroidery only shop right now and you don't know how to get into printing, there are so many things that you can do with a heat press that I'd say the heat press is the first edition you should have. Whether you then go on to, direct to film transfers, white toner transfer printing, or just stick with cut heat transfer materials, cut heat transfer vinyl and flocking and glitter, all of that stuff. However you get into it from that point on, starting with a heat press so that you can add printing to your mix is always a great way to increase your available offerings. And with the kind of heat presses we have these days, there's quite a lot of upside to that. So heat press is always a great option. I'm not going to throw that out there without admitting that heat press is definitely a way to handle this stuff. But like I said, we're talking about other stuff today. I want to go ahead and get back to our topic just a little bit and say we're talking about like non-apparel in the hoop items and how we've seen those used for business. And like I said, the easiest non-apparel items are the classic items. Certainly, I talked about some of the stuff we're dealing with before with those straps. If we're dealing with stuff that is not uh, whole cloth that we can't hoop normally, we do have to remember those processes. And I'll talk about those again. But there are certainly things that don't require all those processes. The easiest things always are going to be items that we can hoop normally. And like I said, if we keep in mind that we want materials that aren't going to tear up our logos terribly, that don't need a lot of babying or don't cause a lot of difficulty, they can be easy to add to the process, right? Not everything's going to be like that. And in fact, it's a very small number of things that don't require any attention to our either our file or our process, but there are certainly some things to handle that we can do that with. And so let me bring up just a couple things and talk about them. The easiest thing ever to add to a product line that's a non-apparel item uh, absolutely has to be bags. Now it looks like I may be having an issue with my tab here. I'll see if I can get this to open back up. Here we go. So one of the things I did very early on in my career was actually start a secondary business inside of a business, and I did so with regular tote bags. This is an example of the tote bag that I was specifically using at the time. And this one was done for a folk music kind of niche market thing that I did for a while. This is the Hourglass Dulcimer tote. I'll bring it back and show you a better one that's not just a product picture. We'll show you some of the other stuff in a minute. This is one of the ones that I had pictures of back from the day, and that's the Hammer Dulcimer tote. This is a very simple, fairly finely woven canvas tote. Does this have a little bit of waggle? Do we have a little bit of needle deflection on small text? Yes, we do. But as we can see with these, I'll bring the other one up again. It's not a ton. Yes, there's a little bit of edge quality issues on this one. Luckily, because of the kind of work I was doing, having it look kind of natural and rustic wasn't too much of a problem. But for most corporate logos, I find unless they have really teeny tiny text and details, something like a standard tote like this is super easy to add. And most of the time, we have a nice hoop area that can take a left chest logo or a larger logo very readily. And though a left chest logo doesn't always look super impressive, especially on a bag like this that doesn't have any details, ones that have, let's say, some straps, as long as the hoop can fit between the straps, or we have some color or a colored gusset, something like that that adds a little more detail to it, can make it much more versatile and make it look a little more attractive. And especially if we can bring in totes that have color straps, colored gussets that match the corporate logo colors or have something to do with the corporate logo colors and styles that are available from the customer. So whatever's in the customer logo, that can certainly help. I'm going to show you another thing that is a printed item, something that can have embroidery, and we'll talk about that as well, right? Because I talk about print, this is a printed item and we'll discuss it. This is one that was very popular for a while with us, and this was wine totes. This is a felt wine tote. You can do these in several ways. Once again, I haven't seen them for a while, but you can sometimes get these that are flat, that are not put together, or you can take one of these edges out and stitch on them. In this case, these were done screen printed. I've also done them with heat press materials pretty readily, but this is another thing that's great for the right markets. It's not an apparel item, but was fairly easy to press flat and use with print. And like I said, embroidery, it is possible to do. And if we can find them, like I said, I haven't seen these for a while, but where they have that split edge or where they are put together flat and you can run a couple of seams up the side, we can do embroidery in them as well. The other thing we can do with them these days, we make patches. All of this stuff, like all the stuff we're talking about here, patch making can be part of this. We can add a patch to something like this very readily, either through heat pressing or depending on how you're doing it. If you have them open, you can stitch them, but heat pressing them on with adhesives can make a great way to make one of these things look lovely. You do a patch ahead of time, and then we can use those patches for multiple things. The best non-apparel item ever, in my opinion, is a patch. And it's something that we can make small, run in the hoop. I teach it, other people teach it, the embroidery nerds teach it. We all teach it because patches are very versatile. And if you're somebody who's trying to do this stuff like this, or you're doing hats, whatever it is, and you have issues, adding a heat press patch is an easy way to do it if you grab a heat press that's readily available for this work. I think that there's stuff now that works better than it ever has, especially the ones that have like the lower heated platen. But in this case, this is something that we can do on a standard flat heat press. People have done stuff with irons. I don't use irons in the commercial world because I want even pressure and heat. But at the same time, this is something that's easy to do. And we were doing this for real estate people. So one of the things we want to think about with any of these things, how does it apply to their business and how does it apply to their own markets? These people were giving away wine as part of their closing gifts for homes. So that's a cool thing, right? And the other thing I wanted to show you that's kind of in that same realm, something that's fairly easy, are things that are put together ahead of time that you can use. Because like we talk about doing stuff like making these projects like ornaments, right? The ornaments become an entire project, but you can also do things that are pre-made. I showed you kind of the can coolers that were split. That is something you can get readily. There are other things like that. Something that I did were these tags, and I did these for these handmade scarves. And as part of the branding, I stitched these tags, and these tags were already pre-punched. They already had the grommet in them, and all I had to do was plan them very much like I would do an applique. So once again, we're doing the same stuff that I showed you with the luggage strap. Once again, the problem we have here is if we do something super detailed, lots of colors, and we're trying to keep this adhered, you may want to tack it down. There may be holes you have to steam out. You might have other issues with that if somebody's got something super detailed, or we're going to have to find some other way to hold them down to adhere them to stabilizer in the hoop. So we're doing a very a much more labor intensive process than we might want to. But this is something where, especially for single color logos, logo types, something that's very simple, you can get pre-made tags like this and you can stitch them. So but this all kind of predicates this same kind of process. And we'll get more into it as we talk about the ornaments and stuff very briefly. But we have to realize that there's a kind of range of different things we can do to make this stuff work. One of the levels we can be at is to find items that are stitchable, that we can either hoop. The best case scenario is we can hoop them. The second best case is that something that we can adhere, tack down, or otherwise get into the hoop in a way that will allow them to be stitched long enough for us to get something on them. Reducing the amount of stitching we do, reducing the amount of detail, reducing the amount of registration, the number of colors can make all of this easier. But usually this stuff is not super difficult, and it's a great deal like doing applique, a deal like doing patches. However, if we have something like I just showed you where it's not edged, where we don't have anything holding it down completely, we have tags like this, the issue is going to be that we have to allow it to adhere long enough for us to get some stitching into it and for it to hold up to the stitching without coming out of the stabilizer if we use something like a tearaway, and without having any sort of issues with it coming free before we're done with the stitching. So the more stitching we do, the harder that's going to be. The more colors we layer onto it, the harder that's going to be. But on certain simple stuff, we can just lay things into the hoop. And that's why I think we see people kind of readily doing things like I said, like the straps. So we do things like the gear straps. We do things like these tags. We can do things in that nature pretty easily because it's not going to be a problem for us to keep those, adhered, to keep those stuck down with things like, the kind of standard quick frames, fast frames that have adhesive layers, or where we can spray our own adhesive layers onto a stabilizer. Those are fairly simple and they can be useful and allow us to use other stuff. So yeah, Eddie says sticky backing. Yeah, sticky backing is one way to go for that, of course. And that's these particular pieces. Yeah, sticky backing would work. Backing where we go ahead and we have a layer on top of it. We take that off and we adhere something with the sticky backing. Super easy to do, but it is more work than something like a tote that is just hooped and easy to go to. So, like I said, that's something we do. We do with the bag straps, something like that. Something we can do with things like these tags. Really easy to add those in and be able to do the backing. That's something that's pretty simple. So the kind of items we can do kind of fall into these categories, right? First, of course, if you don't know, if you see people say this stuff, ITH in the hoop just means you're making something in the hoop. Usually you're crafting something. Just to decide to define that. So when we talk about things like an in the hoop item, or I'm making an ornament in the hoop, the home market knows very readily what we mean, which is that we might be doing processes to something, but by the time I'm done embroidering this thing, I have made a piece. Most of the construction work is done. And when I talk about things like constructive digitizing, this is a very similar thing. So when we are not full-fledged digitizers, you're someone who doesn't want to do artistic interpretation, what I would consider interpretive digitizing. You don't want to take a logo and figure out where all the stitches go. You have that sent out and done. That is a deeper level of digitizing. It requires an understanding of something that's a little more creative, a little more artistic, and has more technical difficulty to it. Whereas things like being able to place a simple applique, adding a patch edge to something, layering together items, or creating your own things like patch edges, stuff like that. I think that's something that can be taught pretty readily. It's about measurements. It's not something where there's a lot of interpretation. Yes, there's creative choice to layering together items to make them work. No, I don't consider it the same as someone who's taking something from a photographic source or from other images and making an artistic interpretation of it into thread. I think that everyone can learn what I consider constructive digitizing. Things like Adding a placement line and a tack down so you can put down an item and have it tacked in place before we can add stuff to it. Adding a border around something to make it into a patch or an applique. Taking an existing design, layering it with another design. And that's not even constructive digitizing. That's just composing something together if the other design is stock, or making very simple things like a simple lace background, simple patch edge stack or patch stack. I think anyone can learn that stuff pretty readily, and it doesn't take the same kind of interpretive skill or the same kind of technical knowledge that it takes to digitize from an image. However, that's one of those things. In the hoop stuff can be difficult to figure out. It's really about understanding sequence. The great thing is there's a world of people out there making in the hoop projects that can then be customized, whether or not they're necessarily intended to be customized. Because if we can remove items from something, let's say somebody's made an ornament that has a big area in the center that's decorated, but we can take out the decoration in the center and keep all of their edges and loops and hangers and whatever else is part of that file. We can use that to create our own customizable pieces without actually doing full on digitizing, even constructed digitizing. Second thing, just to mention it, if you see someone mention FSL, for all of those who are not in the home market, FSL is freestanding lace. This means that something's been made with thread. It's freestanding. It can hold up. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about things like the thread only patches, which do often have like a plastic material in them, though they can be made with a soluble stabilizer, and they can be washed entirely out, heated away, whatever. Some of them will have plastic in them. When we're talking about FSL freestanding lace traditionally, it has something entirely soluble in it, and it stands on its own as an object once it's done, hence freestanding when all of the stabilizer is rinsed away. So home people all know this stuff. A lot of commercial people may or may not. But a lot of the stuff we have that's out there takes a couple different forms, right? Some of the stuff we talked about so far are pieces that are um, not necessarily being edged. If you have something that's like a patch, some of the ornaments that are out there, they might be cut and edged, where we use a cut material. We use something that we can cut and we have as a base or a backer or the main body of the piece. And then we're going to edge it with stitching. Now, that can be either after the fact with like a mirroring machine, if you're someone doing that kind of work, or it can be in the hoop. Either way, we can do that. So, cut and edge is one way we handle these things to get clean edges and make items. We have single standalone items. Some of the other ways that that's done certainly are with things that are just resistant to fraying. Instead of having something edged, we may something that it may have something that is free. It does not have an edge, but it is fray resistant. Either something has been applied to it to make it fray resistant, or we have materials that or we have processes that make it resistant to fraying, or we have materials that don't fray in the first place. So, like when we were talking about those bag tags, the gear tags, that webbing was hot cut. It was hot cut on the end, and because that hot cutting fuses that woven material together on the end, we have something that is fray resistant. It's not going to fray. We don't have to do anything to treat the edges of that piece for it to work. Or you're going to see people is one of the ways we handle having an edge that you're not going to treat is using felt. Whether that means you may still have some sort of stitched edge or decoration, but some people do rough cut. Or honestly, in the space of more creative home market type stuff, you may even see things like intentional fraying, where they make an ornament that's made out of something that's very burlap like, or that has a material that will readily fray, and they leave that rough edge on purpose as part of the decor, as part of the way they want that to look. So the things that we're going to look at with any of these materials, any of these items that stand alone in the hoop, is that we may be looking at how we treat those edges as one of the things we deal with. So, like I said, you may have something cut and edged. Often you're going to have something that's made with twill and thread as your background. Either it's entirely twill or it may have a full embroidered cover. That piece I was trying to show you, which I realized with my green screen is not going to work out, it's from a company called Midnight Society that I can show you. And it's a key tag. And what this is made out of, this is twill with full embroidery. Unfortunately, the greens are going to make it hard for me to get it to work out. It's full embroidery and it has a traditional marrowed edge. So what we actually have is two pieces of fully embroidered material that are then sandwiched together, and they're marrowed as the last stage. So that marrowing edge is actually holding together two layers. This is one of the ways that we can make something like a two-sided key tag. You can do this in the hoop as well. And I'll show you actually a home market example of how people are doing things by setting that second layer underneath the hoop as we're stitching our edging on. So we stitch all of our top piece, we have that done, and we've already stitched the back piece before. We take out our hoop, lay that over, stick down our back piece with adhesives, put it back into the hoop, and then do our edging runs last, and we end up with a fully sealed piece. Some people will even take that opportunity to, instead of doing something like this where we have a grommeted link, if we're doing something like an ornament, to stick a piece of ribbon or some other hanger into the piece and stitch it. What you're also going to see is people making their own hangers using like uh, lace-like runs and satin stitches. So these are all things that can happen. But in this case, this one was done with twill and thread for cutting edge stuff. And like I said, otherwise you might see hot cut materials, or you may see something that doesn't fray like felt. So it really depends whether you have fray resistant stuff, where you have something that doesn't have a treated edge, or where you have cutting edge materials. It can make a difference as to what's going on there. And like I said, even when we're talking about that sort of stuff, we can increase kind of how much labor we do on the front end, or how much we can make this efficient by doing things like pre-cutting. It's very much like patches, right? You want to talk about patches? Patches are a very similar example, because we're doing the same thing. We are making a freestanding object in our hoop. We can stitch an entire span of the things and cut out the edges, or cut them out last. Hot cut, we can either do that with blanks, with items that are stitched out with designs, but then have a free edge, and then later we're going to apply an edge to them, whether that's through a mirroring machine or by applique style, laying them onto stabilizer and stitching our edge last as a second step. Or in any case of this, we can do either spanned materials, where we hoop an entire set of material pre-cutting and we put ourselves some die lines in it, where we stitch lines that we're going to cut out later. Or we can pre-cut either with laser or roll-fed cutters the blanks for the patches, and then we use soluble materials so that we don't have to do any edge treatments. If you want to know more about this, definitely go back to the 2 episodes we did on patches, and we can talk more about that. You can go look at the actual techniques, but it's a very similar thing. Whatever we're talking about with this stuff, when we're into this kind of ornament space, unless it's on the lace side, it really is the same kind of process where we're putting down placement lines. We are putting down materials that will either cut in place, or we have pre-cut blanks, and we are decorating and edging them. That sort of work is very similar, and often with either a tear away material, a material that's going to tear cleanly away, like the plastic layering, or something that is soluble, like a heavy water soluble, in order to rinse it entirely away. The technique that makes it more interesting for corporate work is, with a lot of this stuff, it will hold up to us using a standard logo on top of it, using something that we've already used for a left chest. You may want to apply something for a backer to clean that up, certainly. But whether we're doing something with the FSL, the lace, and yes, it's a lot of stitches, so you may not want to do that, or you're doing something like a simple felt ornament, we can use our standard embroidery files, the stuff that we're usually using for a left chest, and on a piece of standard felt, on a piece of twill, most of those are going to hold up decently well enough for us to do the rest of these processes. That's part of the thing. I think just trying to use things that we have in existence can help. And depending on the tools you have available to you, you may be able to use automation, kind of like I showed last week, and I'll show again briefly, in order to help you create custom edges, create custom sizes, or stock designs to layer these things together without making it an incredible amount of work, at least in the planning and design end, without necessarily requiring you to either have a digitizer do the work, or to do that work yourself if you are digitizing. So that's kind of what we're talking about, right? The investment in it. So let's talk briefly about the ornament thing. Again, it's something that we talked about before. I'll talk about both the patches and ornaments and kind of give you some concepts about it. First, I'm just going to show you a couple of the pieces that I have in my collection, to just kind of give you an idea of some things that I like and I've shown. One of these is a felt. We talk about fray resistant stuff. I did this piece, and this is a personal piece that I decided to do just to kind of show people. Yes, very classic cross stitch style, something that doesn't seem corporate at all. But this is essentially a pre-made logo, because this cross stitch piece was made separately with a contour added. So whatever tool you use, this could be if you have an outlining or contouring tool in your software, you have something like, depending on the advanced contours or what contours you have, or you have something like in Embrilliance, either in Enthusiast, you can use the knockdown stitch tool to make a contour that you can then change in the stitch artist line, or if you can select and outline the stitches, you can make a contour. You can also draw this yourself. All this is a satin contour that was set around an existing stitch file. So this is an existing file with the cross stitch on it. You can certainly do it with other files, but you could do it with any existing stitch file. And then it was cut in post, cut after the fact, to make a patch. I did a really close up on this one because I wanted to show people I was using spun polyester thread, which made it kind of interesting. But you can see I just have a cut edge on this. This was one that was cut by hand. Certainly, I could have cut it some other way to make it better. If I would have cut this, this fleece is polyester fleece. So if I would have cut cut it with a laser, it would have been fused on the edge, maybe looked a little less rough. But this is material that was run in a span. And this is one way you can do this. It's very similar to the way a lot of people do ornaments, except for in this case, it was cut in post. You could do that. And you could even do this and layer in a second piece of felt after the fact. You could run the entirety of this central design material that you have in here, whatever that logo is, layer a second piece of felt underneath the entire piece, have a colored bobbin or a custom wound bobbin, and stitch your edging in while sticking a literally a piece of ribbon underneath that edge. That can make an ornament that will hang. This is one way to do it, and it's very similar to making a post cut patch. You could also heat cut these readily if you wanted to. I don't like heat cutting felt. You could do it with twill, and essentially, I've seen lots of people who go, "Oh yeah, check this out. This corporate company who does badges is offering ornaments. What are those ornaments?" And I swear, what are they? They are patches with a piece of ribbon on them. That's it. It's a patch with a piece of ribbon adhered to it, often in the process of heat pressing the backing on or adding the border. But that's the thing. We could do this in any given way that we're making other kinds of free floating, freestanding materials. I will briefly show you a couple other things that we talked about earlier. Um, like I said, I'll give you the actual, just a quick show of some of the stuff that we had. The actual file for that original luggage tag that I showed you here. Here is the file, and I'm going to show you. You can see that I actually had. I made these two lines here for this piece, and essentially for both of these lines, what we have is a placement for the final tag. The piece I had did not have this cut edge on it, but this showed me where I was going to be. And this inner piece is where I could remove the material. I have the secondary material going underneath it for the stabilizer. But that's all it was. It's a placement line. We tack it down and then I stitch that on. That's all that really was, is very similar to doing any other kind of stuck down material. In fact, if you have ever done something like the straps on the back of a hat, if you ever done collar tips on a button up shirt, it's a very similar thing using sticky back material. It's not something that you would necessarily see as all that strange. It's just the concept of finding something like these luggage straps and tags and thinking of those as a way to add a corporate touch or to make a personalized piece for someone. So like I said, not beyond the pale, something that is offered all over the place. But if it's something you're not doing, it's something you can do with your existing materials. If you get further into it, you might want to have specialty hooping. So that's one of the things I thought I would bring up. One of the others I showed you guys before, this concept of the pre-made ornaments and the freestanding lace ornaments. Well, I wanted to show you not just that, but a couple other things that are similar to that that we can customize very readily. In this case, I was mocking an ornament that was already done. It was something that I actually saw someone else showing, and I made my own very simply. And in the fact is, you wouldn't have to go to this detail. I've got the little scallops on here. It's not a lot of work to put those on for me, but quite readily, without knowing a ton about digitizing, it would not take very much for most folks to learn enough to pull out a shape that is the right size, apply to it some sort of freestanding lace, fill and adjust that, copy, paste, stick yourself a border on there. And especially if your fill has freestanding underlay already based into it, there we have a piece that is now going to hold up freestanding and that we can throw a logo or a monogram on top of. And in fact, the thing that I want to show you is when we're looking at a lot of the ornament pieces people make, and here's an ornament that actually we did, a compatriot of mine, Jim, did this from Mylar, and this piece was done for a Mylar piece. So it's super light fills that were meant to go over Mylar. You can see that it has this reinforced edge with a nice double zigzag on it to make it hold up after we tore that stuff away. So this is great, something great to throw in for gifts. Something like this is cool. The thing is, he did this with the with candle motif. This is a classic ornament, but the thing that I want to show you about it, this is not a customizable ornament, is everybody asks me, how do I put these loops? Oh, I can't figure out how to put these loops so that I can put the ornament hangers in. This little loop that's up here, quite frankly, is nothing that's all that incredibly difficult to get your handle on. It is a full circle O. It is a circle, an O with a heavy underlay underneath it that tucks all the way under the border. That really is the beginning and end of it. You could cut some of that off so you don't have a tremendous amount of density, but that is how a lot of these are made. And in fact, I'm going to say to you guys, in the home market, I have seen people take a design like this that will hold up on felt, that will hold up on some other material, cut away that material or prepare the material for cutting it away. They will literally just throw a letter O on a solid, like put it on a soluble material, throw that material in under an applique, and they will type with their keyboards a letter O and add a bunch of underlay to it and use that for the hanger, and it holds up pretty well. I'm not saying that's what you necessarily want to do, but even if you're not a digitizer, you could take a patch and make it into an ornament by layering this little O before you run your final border and then washing out your material, tearing away your plastic, whatever it is. And then take your handy dandy tool. Maybe, hey, why not? I'll give Justin a plug on this. Take your handy dandy Puff Pro tool, like Justin has. So there's 3D Puff Pro if you want to get that. Um, Take your handy dandy little Puff Pro tool and poke out the center of that plastic with a nice blunt but sharp enough object, and you would have a place where we could throw an instrument and a ornament hanger right through that top loop. It's not super difficult to do, and we can do it with an existing patch file, especially. But like I said, there's another piece that was done by Lisa Shaw, and actually, I'll bring back up the original. I would like to show you guys the original post for this one if I can, real quick, because this is something you can go get if you want it. These are on our website over at Brilliant. So we did these Stay Strong and Stitch On graduation bookmarks, and this was back in 2020. So she did it with text that said 2020 on it. However, she offered this thing blank, so you can add whatever text you wanted to it. Same kind of thing. Not a tremendously stitch heavy thing, but it is a fair amount of stitches. I just wanted to show it to you here. This piece by itself, yeah, 14,000 stitches. So it's a fair stitch heavy object. But really, if you want to look at the way that it's put together, up here in the top, that hanger once again is a freestanding lace underlay style under a ring. That's it. Ring of satin, 4-point density, so zero point 0.4 density, nothing super heavy, but it does have extra kind of double zig underlay with an edge run, and it is made essentially just to hold up after it's been washed out from material. And as you can see from the original post, with it washed out, it does still maintain itself, and that little ring is present up at the top. And in this case, it has a tied on tassel because it's done as a bookmark. But that's the same thing we have for that we have for the other kinds of pieces that we have for these pre-made ornament examples. And in this case, the one that I did was mocked after another one someone was asking me about. So in my piece, I have a much larger oval piece, and it looks like I actually have a start and stop issue that I need to fix here. I did this quickly to mock it up for the show the other day. This piece right here, once again, heavier underlay made for freestanding lace, something that's going to hold up a little bit better, and it's a satin stitch ring. That's really all that is, and it's tucked in. For me, I like them tucked in under the final border on the piece. This is made to be done on soluble material, and the great thing is, if we had something like this, we have a logo, and in this case, I've got a simple logo type. I'll just go ahead and copy and paste that in. I could take that, and if I had a piece like this, it was fairly simple. I could just drop it right into place, and that's something that's not super necessarily difficult for us to get done. We can just drop these suckers in, layer it in so that it makes sense in the sequence. In this case, this one's a little bit too big. Size it down. Luckily, even with a stitch file, this one would hold up. Otherwise, I'd be looking for an ornament that fits the pieces. And someone who just puts these together as a construction could throw a corporate logo in the middle of a circle like this, or any number of shapes that are out there available, and toss this in the top of your corporate order that's being done right now to encourage people to do holiday buying and to thank them for buying from you. Like I said, is it something you want to do all the time? Maybe not. It's a fair number of stitches. But if I look at this piece that I have here, even when I take out, and this is one that does not have a tremendous number of stitches in it because it doesn't have a filled element. The bookmark I just showed you had a filled element in it. When I take this out, I've got about 7,000 stitches in it. I throw in a simple logo type. Now, this is a very low stitch, simple logo type. I'm looking at 2,000 stitches more in that piece, 1,800 more to add to it. This is something that is not incredibly time consuming. If you have this in some other fashion, you could even ostensibly run out this background file in your hoop, especially let's say you have a single head machine and a multi-head machine running where you're doing logos and the logo will fit inside this, you're doing it on shirts. You could run out the rest of your logos on the shirts, yeah, or you have this run out ahead of time in the hoop, leave it in the hoop, mount it in, and if you're centered in the same place where the shirts are, you could drop that thing on while you're running a run of multi-head embroidery for the rest of the run. If you had this run ahead of time and it remained in the hoop centered, ready to rock, you could have this on your solid material, drop your logo on top of it, and keep on running. It's not something you'd necessarily prepare for all the time, but it's something you could do to make those things come together. You could do that. And the thing is, yes, it's a little more expensive than a standard thing to make that yourself, but when a customer opens this and sees their particular logo sitting there smack dab in the middle of a lace ornament that they can hang on their tree, with a note from you, this can be a very powerful motivator for them to buy from you, to feel personally attached to you and that you care about their business. So I think there are reasons to do this that are not just making money for itself. But honestly, if I look at this piece, especially with simple logos, the number of stitches is not outstanding beyond belief. It's not terrible. It's not something I wouldn't necessarily do. And also, like I said earlier, if you have other tools that will allow you to do some automation, in this case, I did that contour I showed you earlier, and I can go ahead and I'll take these off so you can just see what I'm talking about. No matter what contour tool you have, if you have an existing logo like this and you have automation that allows you to do so, in this case, I'll go ahead and use a knockdown stitching version to make this happen. You could use a piece that would give you a contoured item. Once you have a contoured shape like this, fairly simple to take this contoured shape, dump in the freestanding, copy, paste, stick in your border, and once again, add your loop. That's essentially what I did earlier. And in this case, my loop here was not a full ring, but I did a little U-shaped loop, once again, with heavier underlay that was tied in and deeply inset to the satin stitch that makes the border. So this is something where you can make a contoured piece, and that's pretty cool, right? And like I said, this one, once again, 10,000 stitches for this. It's 9,100 stitches for the entire piece. Not a tremendous amount of stitching. It's not nothing, but it's not a tremendous amount. If you have a super complex corporate logo, it may be quite a bit more than that. But for a name, for a company name, for a logo type, for something small, the additional stitches that are added to this are pretty minimal. And I think, as we have from Joanne says something interesting there. There's more to ROI than money. Loyalty is priceless, absolutely. And that's something that's interesting and I think is worthwhile. And Ramona says this as well. Tis the season to put out those corporate promo gifts. Absolutely. One of the most valuable things I've ever done in our businesses was to incentivize purchasing the kind of corporate gift packages ahead of time. And the way that I made that easy was, number one, start out by advertising early. Here we are in July. Advertise early to your corporate clients, your best. And how about this? Don't do this for every client. Do it for your top 10. Don't do this for everybody. Make something really cool for your top 10 clients and see how they feel about it. Or if you're trying to court a client and you can't get them to convert and you think that they've got something behind them, you've got some purchasing power, make something really cool for that client. But start early and advertise. Put this into a box of existing garments, and believe me, they'll start thinking about the holidays and you'll be a part of that thought, right? You'll be a part of that thought process. Also, add a discount for them to order well in advance, to order things for the holidays well in advance and to prepay or put down a deposit. Add a discount if they do that with you. And if you want to go extra mile and make it just as easy it can be for your clients, put together a list of holiday items you think are great for their market, great for their employees, great for maybe their customers down the road if you're doing work that they're going to be selling themselves or using themselves, and put a contact sheet of that in the top of their work. Hey, you want to do it digital? Great. Put together a digital contact sheet, do all of this and send it to them. Heck, throw a QR code on a sheet and throw it in there so that they can look at these things and look at all the details and check out 3D models or videos, whatever you want to do. But get this stuff in front of them, surprise and delight them by showing them something they didn't expect, like the ornament, and then make them have an incentive, give them a chance to make it easier on them and you to fulfill holiday orders. Right? It's something cool. It's something cool. And honestly, I'll say most of the time, in fact, I'll go ahead and bring in another comment from Joanne because this is true. She says, do it with a giving heart and it will show. Do it with their logo, not yours, is another rule. A gift with their logo or their name on it is a gift. A gift with your logo on it is marketing. It's not that you can't give stuff with your logo on it. It can be very cool, but it's not necessarily something that you always want to do. So, like I said, I think that's useful. That is useful. And I think it's something to think about. What am I giving them and how am I incentivizing them and what am I telling them about how I feel about their business? How am I showing how I care about what they bring to me and that I care about how their business is functioning and what I can do to make them more able to do things. So I'm going to show you one other thing, a couple things, just another ornament process that people use, making felt ornaments, which is, I think, even easier, lower stitch count, but it does require either post cutting, pre-cutting, or dealing with the ornament fabric itself. And I'm actually going to use a home market tutorial to show it to you, because I think it's just as valid as anything else, because this is the same kind of topics we're going to have to get into. How do we cut it? How do we handle it? How do we edge it? What do we do with it? And it shows you kind of the different ways we can do it with more or less technology by showing you this stuff. So the first thing, I'll actually show you a really cool set of ones that was done by a good friend of mine. So Carolyn Cagle, who's often on here with us, a good friend of mine, used these designs of mine to make these felty ornaments. And she essentially did these by go ahead and stitching them on felt whole cloth. Then she did that same material method I talked about earlier, where she sandwiched them together. In this case, I believe some of them were blank on the back, and some of them actually had memorial messages, personalized text on the back of the ornaments with the year, which is awesome for things like that. And she then stitched them together on the embroidery machine once they were layered. So we have the one piece in the hoop, we stick the other one on the back because we can see it with placement. We get those lined up, and then we stitch our edging together. And in this case, these were hand cut. That's one option. It doesn't require you to kind of work too hard to get the edges nice. It's just these are relying on the fact that that felt is not likely to fray. That is a really cool way to do it. But I wanted to show you another way that people do it. And like I said, I'm going to go ahead and go right to a home market thing. This is Embroidery Library. So Embroidery Library, emblibrary.com. You've seen it a million times. A lot of these stock designs that do this, I've seen follow this same kind of pattern. So I thought, why not? We'll give them a nod and show you what they did. You can see that in their particular piece, they have a wrapped edge. They have an edge that's done that essentially wraps around the outside edge of this piece. And this is how they did it, right? So they're using fabric for it. In this case, flannel, something else like that can be used. A lot of people will use felt in this case as well, but you could use something that needs a little bit of edging because we're going to actually stitch edging on it. But I just wanted to kind of show you the process. This is where it's an in-between step between doing something commercial and making all the blanks yourself, doing all of that process ahead of time, and something where we're doing a lot of hand cutting as we go. They actually employed what they call a die line, and I've done this before too, where you stitch out onto fabric um, outlines of the pieces that you need, and you pre-cut them. So you're still pre-cutting the backs because you have this die line. You're stitching those out, but you're using the precision of the embroidery machine to create the lines of the cut materials. If I were going to do this in the shops I ran, I used a regular kind of knife cutters, very much like vinyl cutters. You can honestly things like crickets and stuff like that that people have now, or the scan and cut do the same thing. But I was using a large commercial version of those, and I did this with a vector file, and I actually cut it out. Cool thing actually Embrilliance will do is take a stitch file that has one of these die lines, and it will output it to a cut file. So if you have Embrilliance, you can also just output a cut file directly for your cutter. For me, I would usually go into vector software and draw this or copy this out and just make, especially a shape like this, I would just measure the circle and I would cut those all out ahead of time. But part of what you can do instead is this. This one was using die lines and printing. They were printing this at 100%, sticking it down and pre-cutting it with a scissor. Just go ahead and pre-cutting it on the material. You can do that, or you can run the die line through the material. You can run a bunch of copies of the die line and then cut just on inside the edge of the stitching. But they were making the pre-cut backs for these pieces ahead of time. Then they were hooping their stabilizer, putting those pre-cuts in, like putting down a regular placement lines. This is just like doing patches, just like doing applique, putting down those pre-cut pieces they made with the die line, stitching out their edges once they did. They're doing the tack down first, then they're running their design. And as you can see at the very end, they're throwing a piece of ribbon in it, taping it down, sticking down with adhesive their back piece of the felt, and then they were using a matched bobbin to stitch their final edge. Like I said, the reason why I didn't make a tutorial for this is a fine enough tutorial. It's very similar to making a patch in the hoop. Any of the things you learn about making a patch would help you get here. It's something you could use those. The only thing that's vastly different is that we're adding a cover material, though some people do add stiffening materials at this same point right before the edge goes on. Especially if they're pre-cut like this, it means you can wrap the edge with your file. So something that's made for patches is very similar to this. Small run patch making is very similar. And as you can see, you end up with something that has a fairly nice edge around the outside edge. In this case, they didn't worry too much about it being ultimately clean, but it's very easy. This case, they're using tearaway and tearing it out of the hoop. For a lot of us who do patches, we would be using plastic. Plastic would be fine for this. You could use the plastic tear method or other kinds of patch films. You also could do the washaway method. Use a heavy washaway stabilizer. So if you're somebody who's already doing lace for other stuff, you could still do this applique style patch style rendering of it and do it that way. Now, because they're using tearaway, it's great that they're using that ribbon for the loop. If they were using something soluble, they could do the trick that I showed you earlier, and they could have the stitched in loop the little stitched in ring, and they could just use that to either tear out on the plastic or they could wash that away if they were using soluble stabilizers. So, like I said, there's multiple ways to go about it. If you're doing this with the lace, of course, you're going to be using a some sort of soluble material that washes out or that heats away. In my case, I like to use a fibrous water soluble material for something like this, but that does add another step. The other step being rinsing it out. The one thing to think about with stuff like laces and stuff like that kind of edge that is interesting here is, as they pointed out, they used a pre-wound bobbin. We talked about this last week. You can get things like Filtech has colored bobbins, so maybe it's just not as visible. I have frequently used just black bobbin behind things to make it fade away a little bit more when it's hanging up on the tree. But ornaments, you may want to treat them like something that's going to be seen from both sides. The one great thing about using the technique they did, where they actually had both sides dealt with. I think I may have accidentally closed it up. There we go. The way that they use the back patch to cover up that area, another piece of material, is that we have less of that to worry about, and it's only the outer edge that we have to worry about to make that happen. If you're doing it with something like the lace style patches, you're going to be seeing bobbin on the back of the logo as well, and you may elect to do something about that. It is kind of a vote for using some sort of material piece. And like I said, you can also just do these as patches. You can make a patch, add a attachment ring on the top, and that can be an ornament. You can treat it just like a badge. A patch can be an ornament with no problems. It's not exactly something that's all that difficult. And other things like we have, like Lisa's bookmark, which are very nice, can be used for similar purposes because we can lay almost anything on top of a very stable grid like this. And if you want to know this particular one, the grid that Lisa's using here, it's a freestanding grid, so it's kind of a double mesh grid. Her density is at 2 mils. Stitch length for her is at a 2.5. But some of the ones you're going to see out there will use a diamond instead of a square pattern. Up to you. I find that the diamond is a little looser looking and tends to wash out with a little bit kind of a wavy treatment. It doesn't look quite as to me as little as tight as the diamond, but it is also a lower stitch count. Depends on how you feel about that looseness, what that means to you. But yeah, the felt method, the cut material method is also a perfectly fine method to use. And you're going to see that if you don't want to make these things yourself, whether it's the lace work or anything else, tons of people, and I'm just showing random people here. This is Embroidery Avenue. There's a million different people advertising these. I'm not going to endorse one because honestly, when I look at most of them are very similar. It is especially the lace ornaments. It is a mesh. It's a FSL mesh, a very standard mesh like this that will hold together with a satin border and the ring on the top. A lot of them are like that. And in fact, that's very similar to what we have from Lisa here as well, too, though she does have and it's actually a card fill on her original. She's got the fill top that she used for her piece. And like I said, there's a million other things we can do. As you see here, we've got key tags as well, snap tabs. That's a real a classic for the home market, but we could use things like industrial cutting to make those a little easier for those of us who have that ability. But you can also do things like general shapes. When we were doing the Stay Strong Stitch On kind of campaign, Lisa did a great deal of work with these standard kind of shapes. This scalloped shape, she made a key fob. All you'd have to make this happen is a punch and a set, so you can set a grommet or set a rivet like this, and it's pretty simple to do. And as you see, she did hospital administration staff, she did nurses. Further on, we have this nurse piece, and that was actually done with all of these materials are ones that don't fray, so they're post cut. So we've got vinyls, we've got cork being used in this case. Um, Here's one she did of a square thing she did for a place setting key fob for the people who are delivering food and groceries. So making some universal shapes like this can mean that we can throw logos onto those and make that something fairly simple for us to do kind of after the fact. Same thing with this bookmark where I contributed my little Star of Life design here, and she took one of our awesome fonts that we reworked and made a bookmark that's done on, once again, material that won't fray. I did want to show you one more time an example of that piece that I showed you earlier, and this is from the Midnight Society. They do lots of cool kind of like pop culture stuff. And in this case, they actually did this one. This particular one has open twill as the background. The piece that I have here is one I actually bought for my wife, and I'll show it to you guys one more time if you want to see it. Not going to show up because of the green screen, but you'll see it's they did kind of like this fake national parks. And this one, Isla Nublar. If you don't know Isla Nublar National Park, well, that is a reference to Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park is like my wife's favorite movie ever. She loved it when she was a kid, so she always loves Jurassic Park stuff. And so this was done once again, fully embroidered. You're not going to see the best of it. I'll try and give you as much as I can. Fully embroidered over twill with a classic marrowed edge, and this was sandwiched together and marrowed in one piece. So the edging was applied after the fact, and then we have a grommet applied with a split ring. So grommet applied with a split ring, and let me tell you, these are certainly costing enough. In fact, I'll go ahead and show you guys again. When we bring up that screen, you'll see that was $8, and they're making a ton of them and only with one logo, so they're not customized. I would charge more in this case. These ones are not fully covered in embroidery whatsoever. They're only charging $8. They're probably doing these on a much larger scale than we are, if we're doing one piece for a company. But we can charge money for them. They are not something you do for $2 on a random scale. You need to make sure you charge enough. And in this case, these are being done at a larger scale. They're cutting lots of them out. They're running all the edges all at once. They're doing them in production. So as we can see, they're being done as production merch, but there's really cool stuff you can do with that kind of idea. And in this case, we have embroidery over twill that is edged after the fact, but we can do the same kind of work we saw done for that felt piece. If you remember the felt piece that we had over here at Embroidery Library, well, what did we do, right? We had our blank felt, and I actually think this might be flannel, not felt, but we had our blank material pre-cut, which I'm sure they have the same thing, or they have it in spans and they're running it. But once it's cut, then we can layer in a back piece. We can stick it down while it's still in the hoop, and then we can run our edge on the embroidery machine. We could do the same thing and produce something similar to this. It would not be identical, but it's something similar. It's something I've worked on. I might share my own fun pieces I did later on down the road, but it's something you can do that's very similar to this type of work. And I think it's something that's interesting to see, right? So, like I said, I think they're pretty cool. It's something that's cool to check out. The key tags that they've done are inspirational, as you can see. Lots of different ways to handle that same kind of thing. But the concept being that we have something that is pre-cut, two-sided, stuck together, and edged is something that can make some very, I won't just advertise for Midnight Society, something you can get to make some very cool pieces. So like I said, it's something to think about. It's something we might think about, that we can make things with our existing equipment that don't necessarily require us to make a ton of extra acquisitions to make it happen, or to cause us a bunch of grief in the process. So like I said, not something you're going to do for every client, something that is great for amazing, amusing, and surprising people. And depending on what it is, I will say some of the stuff that I just showed you, like those embroidered key tags, if it needs to go at scale, you can go to any emblem company like Pen Emblem or Suntex or any of those companies if you are a corporate person like I was, and you can order them in larger quantities. You can absolutely order things like this pre-made in larger quantities from old school emblem houses. One of the great things is that if we understand how to make them on our own machines, we can make a piece like this. We can make it as a sales sample. We can show it to our clients, make sure it's something that we can get on that commercial market, that we can have an emblem manufacturer create, and then order it in after we've done the creative work in house, and then we can do it at a different scale and make more profit on the piece. So there are still ways we can scale it. Like I said, I love doing this type of stuff for promotions. It's really great as a giveaway, as a promotion, as a way to amuse, amaze, and impress our clients, of course. But you can certainly charge enough to make it work worth your while. And if you get your process down to a science, if you get the right equipment to make it work for you, that can help. So we had a last couple of comments here, and we'll go ahead and grab those. One of the ones I didn't get to show, Joanne says, "What's a Puff Pro tool?" And I'll be very nice and give another bit of like free advertising to somebody who I like here. So Justin has these at 3dpuffprotools.com, and I'm literally going to bring it up as we're sitting here. So you'll see me stop just for a second to get that up on screen. So I'll bring it up on screen. But this is the 3D Puff Pro. Easier to show it to you here. And this is something Justin came up with and is marketing with Jerry Lee's company, Sun Chaser. But what it is a tool that allows you to press into 3D foam to poke in all the little pieces that stick out without shredding your thread. Lots of people, when they're done with a 3D foam piece and they have a little piece sticking out, they will go to poke it or press it, and they'll use the end of a trimmer or something sharp. And I used to tell them all the time to get a chopstick, get a knitting needle. But hey, if you want something fancy and a little nice that is specifically made for the process, it has some knurling on it, as you can see, so you can grip it a little easier. And knurling might not be the right thing. There are little grooves that go concentric grooves around it, but you can certainly it's very much like knurling. There's some texture so you can grab it easily. There's a point on one side. There's a flat blade like stop on the other side, piece on the other side. For the end that helps you kind of wedge under and pull out foam. So it's made for 3D foam, but honestly, anywhere you need a probing tool for your embroidery that is sharp enough to get into a small area, but you don't want to necessarily be shredding thread, it is blunt at the end. So it has a nice tip. It's a nice machined piece. So there you go, Justin. Go ahead and send any affiliate check my way when you get it. Tell them Erich sent you, since that was like a free spot on the 3D Puff Pro. But hey, why not? Suffice it to say, some tools are very useful to have, but that's something that can be useful to have. The rest of this stuff, like I said, the things we need to consider while we go ahead and close this out real quick. Um, some of this stuff is interesting, but yeah, we had some concerns, and I'll go ahead and agree that we saw concerns earlier about this, and I'll have to make sure I said. Jenny said lace is too time consuming. I get it. Freestanding lace can be really time consuming to run, and it may not be for every client or every use. And I agree with you. The problem we can get into is things can look really cool, and we work on them and we make these pieces, and we find out we have so much time in them that we just can't charge what we would like to, or that when we try and charge for them, people don't love them. I will be clear and say we need to know how much time we spend on these, even if we use them as giveaways or marketing, because someone will ask. They're like, oh, I want 3 more of them. Make sure you know what they cost ahead of time and be clear about that. But I do think it is interesting as a potential way to just add a little sparkle to an existing order to reward somebody who's there. And it's also fully okay for you to tell people, oh, yeah, these aren't for sale. They're very expensive. And if someone says to you, no, I really want them, quote them correctly, make money on it, put your profit into it. And if they don't want them, that's okay. That's fully okay. And you can, because the thing is, even if they don't order them, now they know that you gave them a product that is worth that much money, that much effort that you put into it. It's worth that much. And you gave that to them as a special reward, as a promotion to show that you appreciate their business, even if it's something that they're not willing to pay for. When they're going to order something else, you'll say, you know what, I just do this. It's a special thing I do for certain clients. If they're not happy with how much they cost, I don't think they're just going to go out and attack you because you've handed them something promotional for free that's nice and has their logo on it, something that celebrates their achievements. Certainly, I think it's a lot easier with the patch style ones. We all know that patches absolutely can make money. If we look at the people who are in in the chat right now, and any of the people who have been at my classes, I've made money on patches, and very many of them are making money on patches right now. It's a very similar process to making patches to do a lot of this stuff. And I will say there is no shortage of people making bag tags, luggage straps, or any of those things online. I will say a lot of them are probably making it at better scale, because instead of using things like sticky backing, they're probably going on to straps and clamps and ways that make these things more viable for larger production runs. Something that's easier to make it happen. So, like I said, look into it. Think about it as something that makes your creative side happy, as well as something that delights your customer and engages them and lets them know that number one, you're thinking about them. Number two, that you have these creative opportunities. And number three, if you need a non-sized item, that you will be able to come up with something. That if they need something novel, they need something that's not the same as everything else, that you are the creative person that can do it. And I would say, honestly, you definitely can. You definitely can make money on it, but you have to know what you have into it. And if you're going to be making lots of these things, whether it's the ornaments, whether it's the bag straps, whether it's any of this stuff, even the tote bags to some degree, specialty fixtures can make it easier and make it worthwhile. A lot of people I know who do tote bags all day have clamps that are easy to open and shut, because tote bags can sometimes be done without stabilizer, with just clamps. And if you get those nice clamps that hold on firmly, you can make that process really quick. But that's something for someone who's setting up to do those all day long. Someone who does personalization all day long in the same spot on the same kind of bags, having a specialty fixture can really make that quick. But that's not for everybody. That's not for every usage. I would say for most of us, we're going to be like Cindy here. Tear away with spray adhesive for sticky backing. Absolutely. That's generally what I did. Make a small makeshift spray booth so you don't get spray adhesive everywhere. Use embroidery specific light spray adhesive. If you're around screen printers, get them away from that that place with the palette tagging spray. It's too heavy and it's going to gum up your needles. And watch for gumming up your machines, but keep that spray from getting everywhere. Set up a little spray box, spray some stabilizers, and make it happen. I mean, it's something that we can always do. And like I said, you can always up your game. You can add more, but you don't have to start with more to experiment. And the first thing also, make some of these for yourself and make the decision. Time it, see what it takes, see how long it takes you to do it, play with the tools you have. And if nothing else, stop and think about what your machine embroidery can be and what your embroidery machines, what the other equipment you have around you is capable of. Think about how they can work together to make new combinations, new products, and think about the tools you have. Like I showed you with the knockdown stitch and with the patch making tools from Marilyn and Brilliance, the contours that were in Wilcom, whatever it is, whatever tools you have in your software, think about what those tools can do beyond making a line that stitches can follow. What can we do if we put these things together? Specialty materials and stabilizers, the tools we have around us, the logos we already have in existence, perhaps, the automation we have in our software where we can make contours and we can make patches automatically, and a little bit of know-how about how things go together, about how those materials work, and about how the digitized elements we have can get that second life. And like I said, let it cross-pollinate. Look at all the different places where embroidery is made and how it's made, and let those different processes live together in your head, and you may find something new that I don't know. If you do, I'd love to hear you comment about it. All right, folks. With that, I'm happy to have this be the end of my Education Friday, but I hope that your education keeps on going and you take some time to play and find something new that you can make in the week to come. It's a great Friday, and I can't wait to see you again next week.